This podcast is general in nature and hasn't taken your circumstances into account. It's important you consider your personal circumstances and speak to a financial advisor before deciding what's right for you. Any general tax information provided is provided as a guide only.
So another monthly CPI print for the month of October. A bit of a mixed result. The headline number tad softer than market consensus, up by 2.1% year on year. Our own forecast was 2.2, so pretty similar to our own, but consensus forecasts are a bit higher at 2.3. I mean, it's marginal, but the trim mean was up by 3.5% over the past year. So in underlying terms, inflation's still too high, but that's unchanged from the September quarter. What did you make of some of the components in the CPI figures?
To be honest with you, I thought there was good news and bad. The bad is that the so-called trimmed mean, which is the Reserve Bank's preferred measure of underlying inflation, it actually rose to 3.5%. So the headline number came
from
down
3.2?
From 3.2. So the headline came down or stayed at 2.1%, so within target at the bottom end. But of course, the Reserve Bank will say, well, that was mainly due to the energy rebates. If we strip them out, we'll end up with a higher number.
I know, but that's what people pay though. At the checkout, you're not paying trim mean inflation. You're paying you're paying headline inflation basically.
You are. It's the measure of the cost of living. I mean, a lot of people would debate with the 2.1%, saying, oh, it's not like that. But I think many people confuse the price level with the rate of change.
Yeah.
So what's happened here is that the rise in the cost of living, 18, 19% over the last 4 years, that's still in place. But the rate of increase in the cost of living, which is the rate of inflation, is slowing down. And you're right, that's what people pay. But the Reserve Bank is focused on what is the more sustainable trend in inflation. And they would say, yes, it's coming down. The trend is down. The so-called trim mean, which strips out the volatile items, it's going down, peaked at 7%, now it's 3.5%, but it's still too high for them. So I could sort of see why they're looking at that. They're sort of saying, well, some of those things that bore down on inflation over the last couple of months, like lower fuel prices, lower electricity prices, rent assistance, all those sorts of things, they're potentially one-offs. And once you remove them, then inflation bounces back up again. But as I say, that was what I thought was the bad aspect, the trim mean. It means the Reserve Bank's probably not going to do anything in the near term on rates. But by the same token, there was something like 50% of CPI subgroup items which saw price falls in the month. Maybe we shouldn't read too much into that because a lot of services weren't measured. Yeah. The so-called alternative measure of underlying inflation, which is the CPI excluding volatile items, and that would include things like fruit, vegetable prices, fuel and so on, and along with excluding holiday travel, it fell further to 2.4%. If you look at a breakdown, a little calculation that I think Me does, or you might have put it together, Me Boo, or you put together, it just shows the number of proportion of CPI items which are having inflation below 2%. There's still more of them than inflation above 3%. So notwithstanding the fact that the underlying measure, the trim mean, is still too high, I think the broader picture is still down. And if you're worried about services inflation, which is still too high, it is actually lower than it is in the UK, where they've been cutting rates already, and slowing wages growth tells you services inflation is going to fall.
And when we think about services, the inflation that's problematic in them is things like insurance, medical hospital costs. Rents are still high, although they have benefited from the Commonwealth rent assistance. But the problem is really that the services weren't surveyed this month. So how much can we rely on the monthly CPI anyways, or how much can the Reserve Bank really rely on it?
Well, you've got to be careful. It's a mess. I mean, my preference was wouldn't.
Then why do we even need it?
I don't know why we have it. I mean, I think it's just something that a bunch of economists dreamt up and went to the ABS and said, we need this.
But it is going to be more holistic next year or the year after, when the ABS will survey everything every month.
But is it really going to improve policy making in Australia? Like, this costs a lot of money to collect this data every month.
Every other country has a monthly CPI, so shouldn't we have the same?
But they don't set interest rates any better than we do. They haven't had any more success in controlling inflation than we have. They've often had a higher unemployment than we have. So I think the Reserve Bank's done a perfectly good job without it. So I was a bit shocked 2 years ago when they told us we're going to have the thing. I mean, I think economists love it because they can talk about it. and they feel justified. And the Reserve Bank probably thinks, well, more data is better than less, so let's get more data. But the problem is you can just get information overload. And I think what's happened here is that we're constantly talking about inflation and interest rates, and that's just making many people confused.
And also things move around naturally every single month. Like the price of items has seasonal factors all the time. Things like rates go up at a certain period of time, education prices, childcare, fruit and veg is always impacted by seasonality and supply chain issues. So just looking at the monthly changes can confuse things because it's sort of all over the shop.
It is. We'd be better off without it. They could measure other things, spend the money on other things. Look, I don't want to be critical of the ABS. They do a fantastic job, but I just think that this one went a little bit too far and we don't really need it. Which brings us to the next issue, which is the broader issue of cost of living. There's been a lot of media coverage on this issue lately. Probably.
I sort of thought it was a problem a few years ago, but it's sort of come back again as a problem. I think because of Trump.
It's partly because of Trump, and I think Trump provided everyone there's a big issue here that lots of governments around the world of both either political persuasion have been turfed out simply because they were in power through a period of high inflation. And which tells me a couple of things. One is inflation impacts everybody. Unemployment only impacts a much smaller group. So therefore governments that focused on keeping unemployment down but maybe sacrificed a bit on inflation, they're not rewarded for that. Secondly, if Trump was vulnerable and other governments around the world, then the same probably applies in Australia. But the question I have is are things really that bad, and why? Why has it been? Because I've seen some reports which show that Australia is actually worse off than most other OECD countries when you look at real household disposable income.
Well, I love it that that this is apparently a crisis. I feel like everything in Australia is sort of a crisis. We're going to fall off a cliff.
Ever since the GFC, it's been a crisis.
Well, everything's a cliff. Like in 2017 when we had the interest-only loans and the changes to those, that was a cliff. The fiscal cliff. It's not really a crisis anymore. I mean, headline inflation is now at 2.1%. If you believe that, I mean, I think that's still fundamentally the price that people pay for things. That's at the bottom end of the Reserve Bank's target band. I mean, I know that part of that has to do with the government's assistance, but it's still helping households. We've now seen real wages growth become positive again. But as you said before, the fact that we've had a 19% increase to inflation the past 4 years and wages have gone up by 14%, people are still feeling like their wages growth haven't kept up with inflation. I guess it's important for people to keep in mind that these periods of high inflation are not going to continue forever. And that's the point of having an inflation targeting central bank, that eventually the underlying pace of inflation will get back to a more sustainable basis. And that's why we've still needed to have these high interest rates. And at the same time, our labour market's still holding up so well. A 4.1% unemployment rate is still around its lowest levels in nearly 50 years. So I think that the cost of living crisis is sort of a bit backward looking and the outlook is a lot more optimistic. Plus we've had tax cuts which started from the 1st of July. I mean, they were not particularly large, but still some relief. And the outlook for the consumer does look better in an environment where you've got lower inflation, the potential for interest rate cuts in the next 12 months and that continuing solid labour market. I mean, the unemployment rate might rise a little bit more from here, but really hard to see the unemployment rate getting to 5% where it was before the pandemic. So as long as you're employed in a job, you can service your mortgage and you still have money left over for discretionary items.
I mean, what surprises me about the cost of living debate is that some of the RBA doves could say, well, we told you so. Wages wouldn't pick up as much in Australia as in other countries, which is been part of the problem from a cost of living perspective. It hasn't kept up with inflation, whereas in other countries they've had wages growth in excess of 5% or so.
So part of the reason for this is because of our EBAs.
If you're on an individual contract, you could be renegotiating it every year and get a pickup, whereas if you're on an EBA, and a lot of workers are, enterprise bargaining agreement, then it could be 3 years before you get a chance to renegotiate again. But the doves on the RBA would say, well, yeah, that was always going to be a factor holding back wages growth and inflation, which is good for.
But now it's bad.
Well, now it's being seen as bad, and it's the same, I guess, with the argument was, well, the RBA by raising the cash rate, they've raised the cash rate less than in other countries. But I always thought, well, that was justified because in Australia we have a quicker pass-through to homeowners because our mortgages are mostly variable rate, or if they are fixed rate, they're just for 1 or 2 years, whereas in the US they're 30 years fixed. So Australian people with a mortgage have seen a 3-4% increase in their mortgage rate, horrendous increases, whereas if you go to the US, it's less than 1 percentage point, maybe 0.5 percentage points. So you could argue that all of those things, whereas the Doves said it would be, and therefore it's no surprise that you've got this cost of living crisis.
And that's sort of been our view, really.
It has been our view. I guess the counter-argument can be, well, that's all true perhaps, but it was offset by massive population growth and massive government growth in government spending.
So can the government spend their way out of this cost of living crisis, or is that part of the solution, that we need to see more government spending to help households?
It's a difficult situation, and I can understand. A member of the public would think, what can the government do to make my conditions today easier? And us economists say, well, if the government does something, gives you some money, then it actually makes life tougher, because the Reserve Bank will then say, well, you've got all this extra money, you'll go out and spend it and add to demand and create more inflation. And the Reserve Bank's perspective is the best thing we can do, the Reserve Bank that is just get inflation back down, get the rate of price increases back down. So I tend to think that it's really difficult for governments in this environment to do something without making the situation worse. And unfortunately, that's what they've been doing. They've made the situation worse. You could argue one round of rebates and so on, but it was all the added spending on top of that. I thought the rebates were reasonable. It's all these other things that have been added on to that. If you wonder, well, why does it cost 25% more, 50% more to build a home these days than it did 5 years ago? Or why does it take 18 months longer? Well, part of the answer is because the people building it are competing with all the public infrastructure activity, which has added to upwards pressure on prices.
And we can also see that overspending by governments, like in the US in the last few years, didn't actually lead to them being re-elected. I mean, the Biden administration put through the CHIPS Act, the Inflation Reduction Act, which really did the opposite to reducing inflation, actually made it higher, and they weren't re-elected. So high government spending doesn't necessarily mean that people feel better.
That's right. And of course, it's led to a backlash. So to me, the message for government is, you've got to act with your central bank to get inflation down, and the quicker you can do that, the better. And that seems to be what has emboldened some people to vote for Trump, supply side reform, as opposed to adding more demand.
So we've actually seen, this is from the Financial Times, 10 governing parties in rich countries in the past year that went to the polls had a drop in their voter share. You can see that UK, you can see that in France, US. So is that going to happen next year in Australia too?
Well, I think it's fairly likely. And a lot of political pundits are saying, well, the Albanese government will end up being a minority government. And then, of course, it's a question of which way it goes from there. If it's a minority government with the Teals, who are Liberals with a green overlay around them, you could debate what they are, but they're probably not going to be more leftist like the Greens are. Then that could be an okay outcome. If it's with the Greens, you could argue that does run some risks, because it could lead to pressure for more government spending, which could then lead to a worse situation in terms of inflation down the track and make life even tougher for Australians. So it's a difficult balancing. I even reckon it's difficult for Donald Trump, because on the one hand, he was elected to get cost of living down. The 4 or 5 million people who changed sides from Biden-Harris to Trump, they don't want inflation to go up. And if he starts jacking up tariffs too much, he's talking about the 10% on China now and 25% on Mexico and Canada. I'm sure it will change by the time we get to the when he takes over.
Yeah.
But if he goes too far down that path, Americans' cost of living could actually get worse, not better. And so you can make an argument that he's going to be pushed, even though they might take a bit of argy-bargy, down a path which is more consistent with tax cuts and deregulation.
So I guess just a reminder for people about how tariffs actually work. Tariff is basically a tax that the importing country places on its imports, and Trump is talking about these higher tariffs on China, Mexico and Canada to stop the fentanyl problem in the US, which wasn't one of the reasons that he put in place the 2018 tariffs. That was more around intellectual property theft concerns with China and trying to reduce the US trade deficit that the US has with the rest of the world. But it does look like we are in for a bit of a global trade shock next year, because he's still sounding pretty tough on trying to put through these tariffs, and his administration sounds just as tough as him, if not even tougher.
That's right. Unfortunately, it's going to be a rougher ride next year. I mean, the last little week, just sort of shows you how erratic this can be. On Sunday, we learned that he's appointing Scott Bessent as head of Treasury in the US.
He's actually quite positive for markets, though.
He's quite positive for markets, and the market celebrated the next day. Then the day after that, he announces the 10% tariff on China and the 25% on Mexico and Canada. Everyone thought, well, what's Canada got to do with it? But anyway, and it's all about fentanyl rather than trade. That confused markets, and some of them fell. The US share market ignored the whole lot and kept going anyway. But it's going to be like this. And last time around, it was watch Trump's messages on Twitter. Now it's watch Trump's messages on Truth Social, which I haven't yet subscribed to. Maybe I should, but
you should. I have.
You have. Well, me's in there as well. So it's going to be an interesting ride. But I think I reckon the lesson from last time around was you get these bouts of volatility, like 2018. The US share market from September 2018 to Christmas Eve 2018 fell 19.8%, almost 20%, almost a bear market. And then Trump realised, well, nobody likes me anymore. I better do something a bit more balanced. And then he pivoted back to the phase one trade deal. So there is that risk this time around that you go through these bouts of volatility, but ultimately he wants the share market to go up, and that's a bit of a constraint on how extreme his policies will get. Anyway, that's all we have time for. Thanks for everything. Thanks, Deanna.
Thanks,
Take
Shane.
care.
See you next time.
For more info on Shane and Deanna's podcasts and reports, head to the Insights Hub at amp.com.au.